Welcome all, and thank you for coming to our side event today. My name is Lindsey Cook, and I'm with the Quaker United Nations Office. And this side event is co-sponsored with the Quaker United Nations Office, Quaker Earthcare Witness, and Quakers in Britain. I am the representative for the human impacts on climate change, and just briefly as the moderator, we are involved as observers not only in this process, but also in the IPCC and the Human Rights Council, which is why I will also reference them. And today we're talking about responsibility and accountability for rapid reduction of oil and gas, empowering people and governments. Lessons learned, ways forward to strengthen frameworks to help us rapidly reduce the end to fossil fuel expansion, the rapidly reduction of use, and having, as the IPCC has said, the chance for a sustainable and livable future on Earth. Before I introduce our wonderful speakers today, I just want to give a framing of why I chose and why we chose as Quakers to talk about responsibility and accountability. And I'm going to do this as a little story quickly. Just before the COP26, the theologian from Durham University, Dr. Carmody Gray, gave a lecture called the Hook Lecture, in which she challenged us and said, what do we want to sustain? We must ask ourselves, with knowing what is happening, why it is happening, and how rapidly temperatures are rising globally, what is it we want to sustain, and what are we going to do about it? Move to the COP26, we have 1.5 C temperature limit embraced in a COP decision. Great hope. We have the first mention of fossil fuels and subsidies. Yes, they put inefficient, but it was mentioned, subsidies. There was hope. But then we had the strange side. There was no mention of oil and gas. Biden, during the COP, was asking OPEC to increase extraction so that they could decrease their gas prices nationally. We had calls to reduce methane, but not to actually reduce extraction of fossil fuels, but to be more efficient in our extraction of fossil fuels, promoting also widespread use of carbon capture storage, which helps to enable use of oil and gas. But unfortunately, carbon capture storage is not yet available to scale. It is extremely expensive, and it doesn't stop all emissions. There were no declarations on rapid increase in renewable energies, and there were no declarations on sustainable economic systems, unsustainable consumption, or sustainable agriculture and diets. Post-COP, the COP presidency gave licenses for more oil extraction, oil and gas. Our human rights champions of Norway continue to give out licenses for more extraction of oil and gas. We shift to the IPCC, and this is me as an observer, just to share. When we got the first draft, we had 2/3 references to carbon capture storage, to 1/3 to renewable energies. That eventually became half-half, well, twice as many carbon capture storage actually as to solar and to renewable and to wind. Fossil fuel wealthy economies were pushing to insert language of abated and unabated next to fossil fuels. Thanks to some countries, including Germany, they led questions on whether carbon capture storage really was available to scale now, because it's not, and therefore we need policymakers to understand what is the fastest and cheapest and most democratic way to get energy out, and that was renewable energies. At the end of the mitigation IPCC negotiations, the Ukrainian delegate said, and I quote, "We need to talk about fossil fuels. This war is about fossil fuels. Globally," she said, "we spend more on fossil fuel subsidies than on climate action, mitigation, and adaptation." And she said, "Please, let us act." We have over 100 years of international geopolitical world defined by fossil fuel centralization, defining our politics and our international actions. And we need to ask ourselves about the role of power and money in why we make decisions to enable more fossil fuels. So what are we doing, and how do we hold ourselves account as human beings, ourselves, our communities, our governments? And today I put together really brave efforts. I want to celebrate those movements that are really inspiring. I'm going to start by framing what is happening. And when I say framing, and Ian is coming, I've asked both the IPCC and the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and Climate Change to talk about what we can save with urgent action or what we will lose without urgent action. So I start with Dr. Johanna Naulu. Johanna was Working Group 2 lead author and an adaptation expert. Johanna, you have spent years supporting the IPCC and its Working Group 2 report for the 6th Assessment Report. And the report highlights the impacts to humans and nature not only of a 1.5 C global temperature rise limit, but also what would happen if temperatures continue at the emissions rate we're in now, which would bring us up to +4 by 2100, if we continue as we are. Could you take time to witness for us what is at stake with our current insufficient action, and what could we save with rapid reduction of the main drivers, especially fossil fuels?
All right, thank you. Yes, I'm Dr. Johanna Naulu from IPCC Working Group 2, so Impacts, Adaptation, Vulnerability. So I thought I'll share some of the assessment findings from the Working Group 2, discussing the impacts and also adaptation, because that's where I see more hope. So our assessment clearly shows that 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change. And we've heard through these meetings in GSC discussions and IPCC presentations that a lot of these people are in Africa, South Asia, Central and South America, small islands in particular, and the Arctic. And the vulnerability is due to overlapping challenges as well. So a lot of people have already limited access to water, sanitation, and health services. Their livelihoods are already climate sensitive. We're seeing high levels of poverty, weak leadership, lack of funding, and lack of accountability and trust in government. And for instance, heat stress is one out of the 4 primary future global climate risks. Exposure to heat waves will continue to increase globally with additional warming, and this would obviously affect crops, ecosystems, and people. And approximately 2 degrees, regions that are highly dependent on snow melt could experience a 20% decline in water availability for agriculture beyond 2050. And we know that climate change will undermine food security as well. So at 2 degrees warming by 2050, people in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Central and South America, and on small islands in particular, are likely to already experience food shortages and leading to malnutrition. About 1 billion people living in low-lying cities and other settlements on the coast are projected to be at risk from sea level rise and other climate hazards by mid-century. And obviously these are kind of global perspectives, but our assessment also goes very in specifics also across different regions. And what this means is that there are also limits to adaptation, and this is something that we cover extensively in the Working Group 2. So looking at both soft limits and hard limits to adaptation as well. So for instance, there are biophysical limits for what corals can withstand the water temperature. And we know that we cannot save everything, but in the assessment also we look at enabling conditions for adaptation. So if we have political commitment and follow through across all levels of government, institutional frameworks that have clear goals, priorities, that define responsibilities for adaptation, also for mitigation, and enhancing knowledge of impacts and risks so that we can improve the adaptation responses that are available. And one of the big items I've heard now through GGA, but GST as well, is the need to really monitor and evaluate the adaptation responses that we are putting in place to track also progress and also understand impacts and future vulnerability. And also inclusive governance that prioritizes equity and justice and direct participation of those communities that are being impacted and overcoming financial constraints as well. So I encourage all of you to have a look at our Working Group 2 report. So we have the summary for policymakers available that distills the main trends, but we also have very region-specific and country-specific information also across the assessment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Johanna. And again, something in empowering is not only what we will lose, but what could we save? What could we save with urgent action? Our next speaker is Dr. Ian Fry. Dr. Fry is the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and Climate Change. But previously we knew Ian as the key negotiator for Tuvalu. And long before I came, he was a very strong voice for human rights, justice, and urgent action. So my question for you, Ian. Ian, you've been working in these issues for years as an expert in environmental law, a least developed country island state negotiator, and now as a special rapporteur of human rights and climate change. What lessons learned or ways forward could you share on strengthening responsibility and accountability, including human rights frameworks, to rapidly reduce fossil fuel, oil and gas activities, driving existential rates of global temperature rise?
Thank you very much, Lindsey. I think I could write a book in response to that question, but I'll try and narrow it down to some key issues. And I'd like to first thank the IPCC for their excellent work, and I think that clearly identifies the urgency of action that is required to address climate change. So I want to address what I would consider processes within this process and outcomes outside it. Clearly, we need to, as we saw in Glasgow, strengthen the language around unabated coal power and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel strategies. We have to return to that language and fix what was a poor compromise. We have to push that language further, and hopefully participants at the next COP will be able to do that. We clearly need urgent action on nationally determined contributions and set shorter timeframes for taking that action. And so we, as the IPCC said, we've got a very narrow window of opportunity to address us and drive us towards a 1.5 degree goal. And clearly within the nationally determined contributions, we have to put a human rights lens on that work as well to ensure that we are taking actions that reflect human rights. We need to ensure that actions like under Article 6, which is the sort of market-based mechanisms, have proper accountability and that they're not used by sectors to escape their responsibilities. And therefore, we need strong measures that have accountability for human rights. We need to make sure that there's procedures for share of proceeds and overall mitigation in global emissions. Connected to that is an outside process is that we also have the voluntary carbon market, and we have to make sure that the voluntary carbon market follows the same sort of rules as far as share of proceeds, overall mitigation in global emissions. And we have to avoid, options that might have human rights implications. For instance, bioenergy. There are examples where that can have human rights implications. Clearly, the global stocktake process under this agreement will be critical in checking what progress we're making and to make sure that there are critical issues addressed and reviewed as part of that. And of course, underpinning all that is finance to support countries take strong mitigation actions. And as part of that, the next COP will be, I think, a finance COP, and so we've got to sort of drive that sort of issue. With respect to the sort of outside issues, I guess there are a number of measures that can be taken to address and bring the fossil fuel industry accountable. So measures around disclosure are critically important, and the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation is an example in that direction, though I have seen criticism that it could be seen as just greenwashing. So it has to be strong measures. We have to apply particular pressure to international transport, the International Maritime Organisation, International Civil Aviation Organisation, which sort of fall outside the mandate of this climate process, to to be responsible, to find responsible alternative fuels that don't cause human rights implications. And, you know, as there are suggestions around that they could help finance loss and damage. Clearly, the role of the legal sector and litigation and to hold countries and company directors accountable for their human rights and climate change impacts is a critical area that needs to be advanced. We need to reform investment treaties and arbitration that give protection and reward to investments in the fossil fuel industry, and this is an area that clearly needs some work. I understand, you know, a recent report that fossil fuel companies account for almost a fifth of investment arbitrations, and they've won 3 out of 4 cases. So this is an area that really needs some work. And I think Belgium have already, you know, asked for an opinion through the Court of Justice of the European Union on the incompatibility of these investment treaties and climate change law. So that's just a quick overview of some of the issues that I think would help advance that agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian, and both you and Johanna, setting that sense of where we are, what we can save, and what's happening. And I really appreciate also talking about accountability of holding companies. I was in a meeting with The Economist with specialists on this, and they were saying, what if we took liability and took limited out of liability? What if we were liable for the consequences of our actions, as citizens must be? What if our companies were too? Thank you so much. I'm going to move now to a political initiative, to Sanlan William. And Sanlan is on the delegation of Vanuatu. And Vanuatu, many of you probably know, but if not, there is a very moving initiative going on, profound, historic, I would even say, which they are leading. And it is the call for the International Court of Justice to have an advisory opinion on the rights of present and future generations in relation to climate change. My question for you is really to tell us, what is happening? What is this about? What do you hope it to achieve? And why is it important for you? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Acknowledging the distinguished members here, studying to learning a lot from them. Also my Pacific family who are inside the room, and also the participants. It's a great honor to speak to you this afternoon. So basically, referring to the question posed by Lindsey, coming from a small island nation like Vanuatu, natural disaster is a norm, and we have been faced with the adverse impacts of climate change in a very big way. And I think most of us in this room can attest to the impacts of climate change in the way that you experience. So we know that there's a lot of work being done in the past, and member states, most of us in this room have been doing in terms of climate change. But we find that there's still a lot that is need to be done to close the gaps. And I think Vanuatu has been at the forefront of climate change also in the past. And this ICJ initiative is one that we feel we're starting to get into uncharted waters, but with confidence in knowing that we'll have that support from everyone around the table, and those who are also in support of climate change. So in September of 2021, my Prime Minister, Honorable Poplo Vuman-Wepur, has launched a campaign for Vanuatu to lead the ICJ initiative, and also calling for the willing and the like-minded countries to support this initiative, and we are targeting to lodge a UNGA resolution this coming session at the 77 in September. And so we're hoping that this initiative will be complementary to the UNFCCC process, and something that a lot of people might have this misconception that this process might, in a way, undermine the Paris Agreement or the UNFCCC process. We can say with confidence that it is not. It is complementary in a way. And it's, we are not targeting a particular state, any particular company. We're hoping that the question that the GA will be asking or posing for the ICJ to answer will be something that will be of interest to every state in answering the legal question as in regards to the rights of human rights in the area of climate change. So again, I want to stress the importance of the resolution, the initiative. It's being, the government is ramping up efforts in its campaign through regional groupings and getting support to set clarity in the whole concept of the initiative itself. We know that the ICJ is one of the principal organs of the UN that has not yet given an advisory opinion on climate change. And I think it's about time that we head in the direction to get some clarity at the highest court that we all are member to. I think I just want to summarize my presentation by saying that the recent IPCC report has made it clear that we have reached the temperature level that requires our serious attention. And I think it's important that we really work together in a concerted effort in any way we can, in all platforms, avenues possible to work towards a positive progress in our fight for climate change. And I think I just want to re-emphasize that this ICJ initiative by Vanuatu will be of interest to every country, small and big, in our common fight for climate change. We just want to make it clear that it will not open any floodgate for litigation, but only provide clarity on existing obligations for states who have committed for the sovereign decision-making process. So an advisory opinion will never create any legal pathways, new legal pathways to accountability that didn't already exist, but will not create new obligations for states. It will simply help us and help all states in particular understand to what extent those legal obligations that they all committed to over the last decade actually apply in the context of climate change. An advisory opinion will help cooperation among all states, not focusing on law for specific countries, but taking a global view, providing an incentive for states to implement the Paris Agreement. So with that, I call on your support for the GA resolution that will be tabled in the 77th session of the General Assembly this year. And looking forward to your support. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sanan. I'm aware how much younger people are inspired by what you're doing because you are talking about intergenerational justice. You're talking about young and future generations in a way that upholds responsibility and accountability as we so desperately want to see happen. And I want to just share that living in Germany, it is very strange to be in a country where there's a great deal of intergenerational grief, a grief of wanting to have a story of what happened in the past that you could be proud of, and very hard to find that for many younger generations. And it helps me to think we need to be brave, we need to be strong, and we need to stand up now while we have time to limit to safer temperatures. Thank you so much. We're going to move now to a virtual speaker. Our virtual speaker is our legal expert, Nikki Reisch, who is the Director of Climate and Energy for the Center for International Environmental Law, CIEL. As you know, many of them have an office in Geneva, but they are also based in New York and Washington. And Nikki is coming in to give us an overview. And I have a specific question for her, for which she's prepared. But as a legal expert in the field of climate and energy, Nikki, what lessons learned or ways forward do you think can help efforts to strengthen responsibility and accountability in major climate change drivers, in particular to help with a rapid reduction of oil and gas exploration and extraction? Thank you, Nikki, for coming in.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I hope I'm audible in the room there. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all, depending on where you're joining from. First and foremost, just a huge thanks to the organizers of this event and for the opportunity to really be part of this esteemed group of panelists who bring so much experience and wisdom and really so much of their own hearts to the collective work of confronting the converging global crises we face of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, conflict, inequality, and the common roots of these crises in the fossil economy. I want to say a few words about the relationship of law to climate change and the climate crisis, and specifically, as the question suggested, to efforts to hold big polluters, the fossil fuel industry responsible for the overwhelming majority of climate-destroying emissions, to account. I'll talk just briefly about some of the trends in the movement for accountability that I think are important to mark and celebrate a few notable wins, and then end with a focus on the remarkable report just published by the Philippines Commission on Human Rights on corporate responsibility for the climate crisis and its harms, because it's really an inspiring example, not just of the power of movement lawyering and people-driven accountability efforts, but a potential roadmap to future litigation to hold polluters responsible. So on a very basic level, as a social construct, law is always both part of the problem and potentially part of the solution. And critically, it's always changing. And so in many ways, of course, the law needs to catch up to the accelerating crisis that we are facing now. But the absence of a specific law, be that legislation or a treaty declaring fossil fuel production or expansion illegal, doesn't mean that the expansion of oil and gas supply today in the midst of a mounting climate emergency is in any way consistent with existing state and corporate legal duties, particularly to respect and protect human rights. In fact, it is anything but consistent with those duties. We're living in this fundamentally changed context, and that change in circumstances has legal implications for what conduct is and is not consistent with existing duties and obligations and with upholding human rights. And what may have been permissible at one time in the past is certainly no longer. So the climate is changing faster than the law on the one hand, but one of the things that's helping the law to catch up, indeed speeding the evolution of the recognition of what law requires, is litigation. And there are a number of cases that are bringing to light the tension between changed climate circumstances and business as usual fossil fuel production, and calling on courts to really address that disconnect and clarify duties. The crystallizing scientific, political, and economic consensus that we've already heard a bit about today is really strengthening that legal case. We've heard from previous speakers about the latest IPCC reports that leave no doubt that fossil fuels are the overwhelming cause of the current climate crisis, the dangers of overshooting 1.5 degrees even temporarily for people and planet, and the risks of relying on speculative future techno fixes if we have any hope of avoiding climate catastrophe. But importantly, that consensus is also crystallizing around the possibility and necessity of phasing out fossil fuels. The idea that renewables and energy demand reduction can, in fact, enable that rapid shift that is necessary. And so we have the IPCC report. We also see that consensus in the report of the International Energy Agency last year, finding that no new investment in oil and gas supply is consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And that consensus is feeding this growing accountability movement, seeking to hold companies accountable not just for their past contributions to climate harm, but increasingly to compel them to change their present and future conduct to align their activities with the 1.5 degree world, on the grounds that they cannot continue climate destructive activities and claim the cover of law. We're seeing a shift in that accountability effort from backward to forward-looking accountability. That is, that the focus of litigation is shifting from the ways that polluters have denied or delayed action in the past by obfuscating their products' contributions to new forms of deception and greenwashing, not denying but deflecting attention from their products' contributions to ongoing climate fixes. And so there's this rising tide of legal actions against a range of actors, big polluters and their enablers, from governments granting licenses, and we heard our moderator refer to the Norway case of ongoing licensing for offshore production, to banks backing the build out of new fossil fuel infrastructure. And those cases are coming under a variety of legal regimes. Last year, I had some really tremendous, just in the past year, up through the present right now, how we've seen some tremendous wins. And I just want to flag a few before turning to the Philippines to close there. But last year we saw the decision in the Milieu Défensif versus Shell case, the landmark case in which a Dutch court found for the first time that a corporation had to reduce its global emissions 45% by 2030 to comply with its duty of care, that is, its responsibility to respect human rights, because of the recognized consensus on the human rights impacts of climate change. Recent wins have also been marked against oil and gas expansion, injunctions against offshore exploration in South Africa and Argentina, against new oil and gas lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico and the US due to inadequate consideration of greenhouse gas emissions. And there's this pending suit before the European Court of Human Rights brought by Greenpeace Norway and Friends of the Earth, really challenging ongoing production as incompatible with human rights obligations. As the Special Rapporteur mentioned, there are also other kinds of suits, first of their kind lawsuits against corporate directors of fossil fuel companies such as Shell for their failure to manage climate risk and prepare for that energy transition. And there are suits against public and private financial backers, including, for example, the UK government's support for bankrolling gas expansion in Mozambique. And there's a critical transnational test case moving forward in Germany by a Peruvian farmer against a German energy company seeking damages from the company for its contribution to climate change that's causing glacial melts, threatening the plaintiff's home and community. So there are these mounting prospects of potential liability across a range of legal regimes that are really accelerating the pressure for urgent action to change conduct now. And I just want to close by highlighting a really inspiring case, as I said, by an important example of what accountability efforts can look like when they're centered in communities. And that's the Philippines Commission on Human Rights final report of its world-first inquiry into corporate responsibility for the climate crisis, namely the role of 47 carbon majors, the largest polluters, for climate harm. My colleagues at CIEL had an opportunity to participate in and contribute to this process through written and oral testimony, and it really was a process that should guide us and offer lessons for how to mobilize and utilize the law and legal analysis and evidence going forward. It's a nearly 7-year process that was courageously led by petitioners from a wide cross-section of Philippine society and coordinated by Greenpeace and other allies. And it provides a roadmap for potential legal cases. The report is a comprehensive and systematic, damning analysis of the human rights dimensions of climate change and its severe and mounting impacts on Filipinos and the contribution of carbon majors, companies, products, and operations to that climate change and resulting harm. The participatory process that led to this report developed an unparalleled repository of evidence. It's really the largest, most comprehensive body of official sworn eyewitness and expert testimonies and documentary evidence available publicly now with respect to climate responsibilities of carbon majors companies. And individuals shared their personal stories of how their lives have been affected, and that was critical testimony leading to the conclusions. And just to highlight those findings here, the findings are critical for holding big polluters accountable going forward. The Commission found that carbon majors and other corporations have responsibilities to protect human rights as we face the climate emergency. And the report documents how the carbon majors have not only contributed to the crisis at a significant quantifiable scale, but the overwhelming evidence that the carbon majors and the fossil fuel industry have been on notice of those risks since no later than 1965, but misled investors, regulators, and the public about risks for decades, delaying and undermining action, and that their ongoing actions to expand fossil fuel production and peddle false solutions are continuing that wrong. The report critically finds that those actions are not just immoral, but in fact may be the basis for liability. And so with that, I wanted to just say that this commission has created a roadmap and a resource for investigations and litigation everywhere, and an inspiring model for how we can mobilize communities on the front lines of the crisis to bring their stories to bear to define what the law now requires. And that evidence and findings are not just useful in the Philippines, but for people fighting for climate justice and accountability everywhere. Thank you.
Nikki, thank you. And that was an extraordinary amount of information and help. I hope you can stay with us for any questions coming. But there is an empowerment there too in how do we hold the responsibility and accountability when we know what's happening. And I wanted Nikki to give us that overview of what we're seeing, because there is an inspiring side to that. You hope that you didn't have to take someone to court to do something that they would want to make sure protected their own children. But when you're dealing with corporations, when you're dealing with profits, when you're dealing with money, it is often beyond one person. And that's why we need the law. I want to just briefly, we tried very hard to get a negotiator for BOGA, but this is another initiative, another political initiative, which many of you here may know about, but those watching, it's the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. It was announced during COP26. It was with Costa Rica and Denmark announcing this alliance to reduce their use and come out of oil and gas, which was an extremely brave initiative at a time, as I mentioned, when oil and gas wasn't being mentioned in other declarations. So while we don't have a negotiator here, I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs about BOGA, because if in your countries this is something that you think you can engage your governments with about as Nikki mentioned, she spoke about immoral, a moral, ethical, holding ourselves to responsibility and accountability. BOGA is the Oil and Gas Alliance, Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which is an international alliance of governments and stakeholders working together to facilitate the managed phase-out, and I repeat, phase-out, of oil and gas production. Led by Denmark and Costa Rica, BOGA seeks to strengthen global climate ambition by aligning oil and gas production with the Paris Agreement goal of well below 2 Celsius, pursuing efforts for 1.5. The alliance will leverage momentum from first movers on oil and gas, phase out to elevate the issue of oil and gas production, phase out in international climate dialogues, mobilize action and commitments, and create an international community of practice on this issue. I want to mention some other countries that are connected. I believe Sweden is looking in, if not already a member. We also have Quebec. We have, in addition to Costa Rica and Denmark, we have Wales, and we have New Zealand as an associate member, and I probably missed some others, but one of the things I wanted to mention about New Zealand is they're also standing strong against subsidies of fossil fuels. So these are political initiatives that we can support and encourage our governments to keep going. And linked to that, we have someone here from Climate Analytics who's just put out a report called Gas is the New Coal. Did I get that right? Almost. Do you want to? But it's looking at the need to rapidly reduce gas as well if we're going to hold to 1.5. And what it means to keep to that temperature limit in order to save not only the human rights from incredible abuses we've never even imagined. But we're also looking at the tipping points in nature. And we have another one, the state of the cryosphere, which has just come out, which is heartbreaking about what is happening to the polar regions in the third pole, the Himalayas, and the consequences to ourselves, our children, and nature. We have a speaker we were hoping from Nigeria, who is not at this moment online, and we're struggling with trying to get the email to him. But I just want to say, Saro is, Pyagbara is the executive director of the African Indigenous Foundation for Energy and Sustainable Development. If we don't get him on here, I just want to say that the last time I saw him, he was protesting in Nigeria against Shell. They have been working for decades on this to enable within the Delta to have a sustainable and safe environment based on what they're experiencing. Without Saro online, I'm going to go to our final speaker. Harjeet Singh is with the CAN International. As many of you know, Harjeet over the years, also before with ActionAid. But Harjeet, in addition to being with CAN International, is now also supporting another initiative, and again, the brave initiatives we're seeing, which is Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And my question to you, Harjeet, could you tell us more about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, what it is, what you hope to achieve, and how people can get involved? Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsey. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. So before I talk about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, something that we have heard on this panel, let me underline. Fossil fuels are responsible for 86% of global carbon dioxide emissions over the past decade. And there's a lot of conversation about renewable energy. Of course, we know that we have seen a lot of progress in terms of prices really falling down, even by 80% in my part of the world as well. But despite renewable energy investment, the share of fossil fuels in the global energy demand remains 80%. In 2009, it was 80.3. In 2019, it's 80.2. That's the progress we have made. So all the increased renewable energy that we are seeing, there's a lot of increase there, but that's feeding to the increased demand. So it's not shifting the dependence that we have on fossil fuels. And let's also recognize, I'm sure many of you know, for some of you it may be shocking, that Paris Agreement does not even mention coal, oil, and gas. So look at the cause of the problem, and we have Paris Agreement, which really talks about emission reduction, which is needed, but doesn't mention what has caused the problem in the first place. And in Glasgow, where it was the first time we talked about fossil fuel, but attached subsidies to that, and only coal and not oil and gas, as Lindsey mentioned in the beginning. And the biggest delegation at Glasgow was from the fossil fuel industry. And now you can connect the dots. And we are already on a path to produce 110% more fossil fuels by 2030 than what is needed to stay below 1.5. And Lindsey, you also mentioned, in the context of war in Ukraine, that how coal, oil, and gas are the greatest security threat today. And we also heard the same thing in terms of climate inaction becoming the major risk that was brought out in a report by World Economic Forum. And the reality is that all the discussion that has been happening here over the last few years are based on a theory that imposing emission reductions and price on carbon will shift markets and constrain supply. So we are shifting a lot on market to change things without enough role of the state. And look at where we are. 30 years have passed. Fossil fuel remains where they are. In fact, after the war in Ukraine, they're going stronger. We are seeing more drilling happening in all parts of the world, particularly in the global north. And when you talk about how we reduce fossil fuel, and even countries like US, Canada, we have seen UK recently also going for fracking. They say, yeah, we'll do all the action. There's so much of hullabaloo around all these COPs and outcomes, but in reality, what's happening on ground is absolutely shocking. And the same fossil fuel industry, you talked about subsidies. Let me put the figure on the table to make you angry. It's $5.9 trillion a year. That's the kind of subsidies they got in 2020. It's not me, it's IMF data. You can Google, which comes to $11 million a minute. $11 million a minute. And what we are fighting for? $100 billion. And what we get is 71% loan. So look at all this irony and paradoxes that exist. And if you see, again, the whole issue around coal, and you talk about oil and gas, coal production has gone down. So Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative did a study last year on, we called it Fossil Fueled 5. So US, UK, Canada, Norway, and there was one more. So their emissions are actually, their oil and gas emissions are going to go up by 33% and 31% respectively. So coal production is going down, but not oil and gas. And this is before war in Ukraine, and we know how the drilling is going to happen much more. So the reality is that we are completely missing the supply side of the story in Paris Agreement in this space. And unless we put a spotlight on the fossil fuel industry, what it has done to us, to our planet in terms of destruction of all kinds, and what kind of measures we need to take. But at the same time, we can't just look at things, with one or through one lens. We also need to understand that there are economies, particularly developing country economies, who are dependent on fossil fuels, which is a colonial legacy, either for their economy or for energy. Which means, and this is where the equity conversation becomes really important, because you can't expect Azerbaijan and Timor-Leste and Congo, whose reliance on oil revenue is about 50% of their economy, but their per capita income is about $10,000 to $20,000 per annum. And then you have countries like US, UK, Canada, whose per capita income is more than $40,000 per annum, but their reliance is 2%, 3% in terms of the economy. And here we have a common finish line of saying everybody should become carbon neutral by 2050. And there's no conversation here except what we saw at COP26, where there was a figure of $8.5 billion to be provided to South Africa to phase out coal. Nobody has seen that amount, not even South Africans. And nobody has seen that framework, how this money is going to help and who will actually get the lion's share of money. Is it going to be energy companies or workers and communities that have to go for just transition? So when you look at all this reality, then you realize that you need a system that needs to put supply side at the very core of the discussion. And this is where the fossil fuel non-proliferation comes into play, where we have to talk about how we need to understand the whole issue from the perspective of equity and justice. And we need to talk about, so there are three pillars that we are talking about. One, how do we must stop all new exploration and expansion now, because there is enough production already in process which is sufficient for us to transition to 1.5 degree world. Second is about phasing out, but phasing out equitably for all the reasons I just mentioned. And third is just transition, because we are not thinking of workers and communities enough. We are only talking about emission reduction without realizing that what's going to happen to people, communities, or even access to energy. Not to defend India, because I'm from India and I don't defend my country back home. But the whole conversation of phase out and phase down, of course, it was a major splash in India. But it happened because there was no real conversation about how that transition is going to happen. A country that doesn't rely on oil or gas enough, it's coal, how do you provide that base load? So when you say phase out, which means absolutely no coal, that's what phase out means. Can that happen in 10 years, 20 years? It must happen. But how it's going to happen? Where the finance is? Who is working with India? And forget about India. I'm more concerned about the Nigerias of the world, the Azerbaijan and Timor-Leste. Who is talking to them? And many of these countries continue to drill even to feed their debts, debt payments. Are we talking about debt payments and sufficiently? No, we are not. AOSIS came up with a statement talking about how their debts have increased. Majority of their income is going for debt servicing. So all these connected issues, there is no conversation happening in this space. We're only talking about emission reduction. So that's why you need to look at a very comprehensive way of dealing with fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are a culprit, but what about people and economies who depend on those fossil fuels? How we are going to provide them a helping hand, through again, using equity and justice lens and as principles to do that. So a couple of steps beyond those three pillars that we have taken. And I must also tell you, this idea, when you talk about how to look at the issue comprehensively, we have support of 101 Nobel laureates who supported these three pillars. We have thousands of individuals and civil society organizations. We have about 3,000 scientists and academics. We have more than 50 local governments and cities who have endorsed, and these cities include Bonn and Paris, which are so vitally connected to the Paris Agreement, and Sandra is sitting here who worked in Bonn for that. And many other big cities, Geneva. And the support itself shows that there's a power in the idea, and how there has been a massive gap. So going forward, and again, that also connects to the point that Ian raised, we need transparency and accountability of fossil fuel companies and governments, and because if you compare it with any other threat of nuclear on landmines, you need to have a system to track the source of the problem, and that's why we are calling for a global registry of fossil fuel production, which is going to be launched in September. And then there is a missing framework for containing the supply and also reducing production in a phased manner, in a planned manner. And then how do we create legal policy and economic tools to ensure that the transition that we need to make is equitable and just. So we all need to be moving in that direction, but we need to also make sure that while we are faster, but we also need to be fairer in our approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Harjeet. And I'm really pleased that you actually were the last to speak to sum up the equity side and also the situations that are very different in different countries. And that links to responsibility and accountability too. I also want to say the holding of the just transition, something that those of you like myself might have been in England in the 1980s, there was not a just transition in the way that coal was taken out. And so what we want to do is learn from our past mistakes. How do we protect people and workers to be able to have their jobs and to transition and retrain into a healthier way? And finally, just the overall sense of how do we take this in a way with India, for example, to phase down coal when the countries that have already phased down coal were not asked to act on what they need to phase down. And that, again, is the accountability. So we're going to open for questions of clarification. But first, I described this as a participatory event. I would ask for the next few minutes, could you turn to someone next to you and just talk to them about anything that in what you're hearing was of interest to you, that struck you, or any questions that you would like to ask that you didn't quite understand. So you can take a few minutes just to say hello to the person, or 3 people or 4 next to you. Say hi, talk, and I'll bring you back in a few minutes. Okay, in about 30 seconds, if you can wrap up with some questions. All right, I'm going to bring you back in. Hello again. I hope we have some questions. Can everyone put their hands up just to stretch? If we can quiet down. Hands up, everyone, for some quiet. Okay, now keep your hands up if you've got a question. Do we have a microphone to pass around? And, yep. Our first question.
Thank you so much. My question is to anyone on the panel who might want to address sequencing and a just transition. If you were talking with a country, maybe a ministry official, what would be some of the first steps, or just a first one or two steps to go in the direction of a just transition? Thank you.
And I think you need to announce who you are.
Oh, hi everyone. My name is Coco Warner. I'm at the Secretariat and I'm here to learn. Thank you.
Thank you. And Coco is very involved in loss and damage as well. Could we take another one or two questions, just then we can bring them together?
Good idea of Coco's to take off our mask when we say hello. Professor Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Seger, and I'm Executive Secretary of the Climate Law and Governance Initiative. So we have a side event right after this one over in the Bonn room on climate law and governance, and I wanted to take advantage to give a moment for the panelists to speak about a couple of issues that we could maybe bring straight into that next event and build up on. And in particular, I wanted to ask, I mean, Ian, obviously, you referred to a couple of key areas where international law has moved on, but is it a sword or a shield? And I'd love to hear from you just your thoughts on a few of the creative options that we could take up in that way. And then, of course, for all of my colleagues, yeah, loss, damage, restitution. One of the challenges we're running into is ensuring that we have enough people trained all over the world, not just in a few countries, who can not just take on the climate litigation that's needed, but also collect the evidence in a way that it could be presented in a claims tribunal eventually. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on ways to push that forward a little bit.
Thank you. I'm going to just keep with those two questions because they're quite strong, and then hold on to your question for the next. The two questions, we have a question about sequencing in a just transition. What would you say? How would you advise those within your communities or governments? And then the second question relates to the international law. Is it a sword or shield? But also loss and damage, restitution links through. Now, we have Nikki here, but also would anyone like to start first? Could we just check with Nikki? I think, Nikki, you can just unmute yourself.
Oh, goodness. Sure. I feel like others on the panel might be better placed to address some of the questions, perhaps on sequencing. I'll just take a brief stab at addressing the question with regard to the law as a sword or a shield. I mean, I think certainly it's both. I don't know if the question was specifically about Ian's reference to ISDS, investor state dispute settlement, is certainly being used as a sword by fossil fuel companies seeking to delay the transition and the phase out of fossil fuels, and their urgent needs to respond and to blunt that threat of the weaponization of investment law to really hold countries hostage and force countries to pay polluters to phase out. And I think there are a lot of creative ideas underway on how to do that. And I think there are both ongoing pushes to reform the system. Of course, the investor state dispute settlement system was created by states, and it can be dismantled by states too, whether that's through withdrawal or termination of agreement, or whether that's through responding to and blunting the threat of action by investors, showing what in fact investors knew and that they don't have legitimate expectations of future profits from fossil fuels, given how we've known for decades about their contributions. But I do think that is a very active area, and I do think that as was echoed by the representative from Vanuatu, existing human rights obligations require and compel changed conduct from companies and states with respect to their ongoing production. And I think the international law, while there is area to evolve and change that law, there's a lot of scope for just recognizing and clarifying how those existing obligations require changed action in the context of the climate crisis and what they mean for the incompatibility of ongoing production. And I think there is a lot of room for bodies from the European Court of Human Rights to the ICJ with the advisory opinion to national human rights institutions like the Commission in the Philippines to clarify and elucidate those requirements and show states what actions they can take, not only to change their conduct, but to hold private polluters accountable. I'm not sure if that's responsive exactly to your question. There are a lot of other issues, but I certainly do think others on the panel may want to address the sequencing and equity concerns, which are hugely important in terms of how we go about transitioning. The one last thing I would say is on the IPCC report, we heard a lot about the critical findings from Working Group 2 about the centrality of rights and equity and about the dangers of overshoot for people and planet. But I think that there are hugely important findings from the mitigation report about just how feasible it is, both technically and economically, to scale up renewables and to address energy demand reduction as the most viable ways, and that the false solutions like carbon capture and storage are in fact among the most costly, least mitigation potential options on the table and need not to be sucking the air out of the room in policy spaces and diverting attention from critical fossil fuel phase out.
Thank you, Nikki. I will pass on to Ian and Harjeet, but what I'd like to add, just following on what you just said, Nikki, grants, not loans, to get renewables out there. If you talk to anyone from a developing country or any community, poor community within developed countries, you will see the need for help to get these in there. And we need to get grants, because once you have grants, you have the ability to get renewable energies into the poorer communities. You're not asking them to buy it when you're poor, you can't afford solar. I'm just going to pass you on. Ian, would you like to go first, or Harjeet?
Well, I think Nikki sort of covered most of it. I think there's a way to sort of flip our thinking on these investor agreements and see them as we're investing in our own lives, that we should be challenging what those investor agreements are and flipping the whole thinking on it. But I also think, there needs to be reforms to those investor agreements. We clearly have to ratchet up the work on disclosure and particular, corporate liability and responsibility, so that work needs to be developed. Thank you.
So let me respond to the just transition question. Thank you very much, Coco, for asking that question. And I think we need to reflect back a little bit on what happened in the last 30 years. And I can share my direct experience, because as I said, in the treaty, we are talking about no expansion, phasing out, and just transition. And we have got massive endorsements from cities and civil society organizations. But clearly, there is an imbalance. More endorsements and support is coming from the global north. And you know why? And I'm based in global south, and I keep talking to developing countries for a variety of reasons. Because if you look at the journey of the last 30 years, what has happened? Developing countries have just been cornered. So rich countries did not take any action. And the whole strategy was how to expand the responsibility. And in these 30 years, of course, many countries became more industrialized. And if you look at where we are, the responsibility has been diluted from developed countries. So now you have more governments or more countries responsible. But look at how much money has been provided to support those countries who industrialized in the last few years and decades, and that was required to take people out of poverty. No support. Was there a plan in 1992 to actually help and talk about transition of any sort, which is just. There was no plan. There was no support in the last 30 years. Look at how we are struggling with Green Climate Fund. And the responsibility has been just widened. And developing countries have no trust in the system. So much of erosion of trust that has happened. Despite that, the moment when you talk about these three pillars, the starting point is just transition. And because when you go to any country, and I was naming these countries, Azerbaijan and Angola and Nigeria, or even Iraq, which has dependence on oil in terms of 90% of its economy, we look at what has happened in this space, just pushing them, against the wall and saying, you have to do it. I'm not going to support you. I'm not going to put any money on the table. I'm not bothered how many people are working in the fossil fuel industry, or whether you have energy access or not. Again, or making India, China as punching bags and completely forgetting about some of the countries that I have been naming. Look at the whole format that we have seen in the last 30 years and look at where we have landed. Now we have landed in the era of loss and damage. So that narrative has not helped. Had we had that narrative of saying we need a different world, we need a just transition because we know there are economies, workers and people who are dependent, we need to help them, than just blaming them. When India used to say, yes, we will do, but we have 200 million people who don't have access to energy. The response was, we don't care. You just reduce your emissions because you are number 3 or number 4 in the list. And I come from that area, I can feel that pain. Yes, it's a large country, but it also has large number of people living in poverty, which is a colonial history. Who was coming to help? So we needed a plan and not a campaign just to push certain countries and completely forgetting Malaysias and Indonesias and Nigerias of the world. Nobody is even talking about them because we don't have a global plan. So just transition is something where we have to say, we will help you, support you to have a plan that will take care of workers, that will take care of environment, that will take care of, the kind of poverty levels you have, how do you do poverty elevation, and then tell us how the international system can support because you are not responsible for the crisis. That's why this global system was needed. So the fact is we need a plan. We need a plan that works for everybody, that leaves no one behind. And then you need a system that supports that plan. And there are no examples. Rich countries have only increased their emissions or stayed where they are, and they have not set an example for developing countries to follow. In fact, on the other, in contrast, these multilateral banks have pushed countries to follow that same Western model which is responsible for the crisis. So, the way we have handled the last 30 years, I think we all are somehow played that role in reaching this point where it's all about loss and damage now, unfortunately.
Thank you. I want to take a few more questions, but thank you, all of you three, for your responses and for your heart and for your passion in this. And also those of you who are in the third working group, in the IPCC mitigation report, there is a strong section on just transition. And that's something that's really helpful if you need a framing, if you need to quote. Just transition was very much present in that report. Now, I know you had a question, but let's pick up yourself. You had your hand up before, and we'll take 2 more questions or 3. We'll start with the man with the tie, the peach tie, and then someone in the back and someone right here.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was actually going to collaborate with my colleague from Malaysia, but I think she left. All of the presentations were quite fantastic, but I think the final one really resonated with me. My name is Chris. I am from Grenada, which is a small island developing state in the Caribbean. About 100,000, 133 square miles. Like Vanuatu, losing land space, and you have historical cemeteries, for example, being negatively affected. And indeed, that conversation about just transition, I think it is something that is seriously lacking in my country, and I guess all over. We are here negotiating and discussing, and there are certain things that are not getting onto the agenda and certain things that are being avoided. But indeed, as we transition, being fossil fuel dependent, what is it that is going to provide us that base load energy that indeed you have referenced? Agriculture, most of the available lands, for example, is into agriculture, so it's about food security and nutrition security. So there is lack of that in terms of being able to put down the solar farms. And then you would have issues in terms of the technology. Yeah, the prices have been going down, but by the time they do ship and get to Grenada, the cost is exceedingly high. And it's just small quantities required, for about 100,000, to be able to supply a grid, for example, that has peak demand of 28 megawatts. And then there are issues with the technology in terms of, for example, the inverters are not necessarily universal. So then you continue running into costs, which makes it quite unsustainable. But we're not having this discrete and deliberate conversations to be able to address this. I would like to have you, do some presentations to the people that are above my pay grade in my country, so that we could, have this kind of particular conversation, so that we could see how we could advance on this topic. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Joy Reyes from the Manila Observatory in the Philippines, and I think this is more me marinating in whatever happened more than a question, but I think a question will be coming up. So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for their very, very fabulous discussions. So I'm gonna start by saying that I'm the same age as all the COPs, and so we were the youth during COP21, and now we're just like here right now and not the youth anymore, well, older youth. And so perhaps this is a question on what you think or what you envision the next steps are. Do you think, well, the UNFCCC is there, the negotiations are there, the CHR in the Philippines released its report, and then Vanuatu is making a move in the UN, in the advisory opinion. So do you think we're moving towards changing the institutional framework of climate change vis-a-vis human rights in the international level? Do you think we're moving into climate litigation, legislation, again, on loss and damages? Are we going to, do you envision seeing more legislation penalizing carbon majors and fossil fuel companies? So that was just something I was thinking about. And then perhaps not so much in line with the discussion, maybe tangentially, but do you think as we discuss accountability and responsibility of fossil fuel companies, in the next few years or so, do we also think about perhaps the fact that even renewable energy companies can fall prey into perhaps violating the human rights of especially indigenous peoples who may have to be forcefully displaced because of say, wind turbines and solar energy farms? Because always the question in just transition, right, is it might be development, but development for whom? If it is not development that is for everyone involved, especially those in the margins, then it is not development at all. So thank you.
Thank you. Can we take one more? Oh, yes, we have, sorry, I pointed to this man here with the blue shirt and the blue mask. And then we'll try to get another set of questions after this.
Larry Moffat, I'm with the Press Club Brussels Europe and also with the citizen movement Rise for Climate Belgium. And I have two fairly specific questions. Dr. Fry mentioned the need to hold company directors liable or accountable. And so I'm wondering, I assume you're referring to the crime of ecocide, and Vanuatu and also Belgium have called on the Treaty of Rome Assembly to recognize it so that the ICC can investigate crimes of ecocide and hold individuals accountable. And my second question is on the issue of litigation. I'd like to know if any of the panelists are looking at the Energy Charter Treaty, which this legacy treaty that crazily enough allows fossil fuel energy companies to sue countries or the governments that want to shut down fossil fuel plants?
Okay, so I'm just going to try to bring together some of these reflections and questions before I hand them over to my colleagues. But, whoops, Granada, one of the things that strikes me in what you were saying is I think you're also an example of are utilities privately owned or publicly owned, and how does that affect our ability to put on solar, and your history of being advised to sell off as a public, and that whole complication of actually not owning your utilities, which I'm sure many of us are experiencing that too, developed or developing. But reflecting on that, I also wanted to say, what are the next phases? What are the next steps? And I briefly would say after COP26, for me personally in this work over the years, I wish I'm not 26, but but what I see is we now are in a place where people aren't denying climate change. They're not denying that it's not happening. We're not in that fight anymore. We are in a fight of what do we do about it? And that's why I wanted to stress again that the responsibility and accountability. And when you have those questions with people without a kind of shaming, but within a heart space, what do we want to leave our children? You can have those quiet conversations as well with those who know that they're not doing the right way forward. So talk about the elephant in the room. That's one of the things I think we need to do in that. But then also with Dr. Fry, you were talking about ecocide very strongly, part of the faith-based communities as well, and the energy charter. Again, I wish we could have had a whole bunch of voices here. But would anybody like to comment on some of these or all of these?
I can talk about the youth part. Another thing that we have seen in the last couple of years that youth took up the slogan of climate justice, which was fantastic. But at the same time, we have seen, and I've been in various marches, and when you talk to young people, you find that they are all behind climate justice, but probably there's a need to understand climate justice a bit more deeply. And this is where the issues that I was raising of equity and justice are really important. And that's the reason we have not seen the progress. If you put yourself in the shoes of a finance minister, and this is something, somebody was talking about sequence, you were saying, Coco, on just transition. I would say, relook at the sequence of the whole climate action, where we stand right now. When you see people are losing their homes, their farms, their houses are flooded, you don't talk about solar panels and wind farms. You talk about immediate rescue relief, and that's loss and damage. And then you talk about making building back better, and you adapt, and then you will talk about solar panels sometime later if you have resources. So even at the very practical level, if you don't get the sequencing right, climate, and if you don't use the principles of climate justice, it's not going to work. And what Lindsey said, and others have been saying, we have to really talk about who has caused the problem. It's 100 companies responsible for more than 70% of emissions. So as youth, you have to ask those questions, and that will bring all of us closer to climate justice. But we have to talk about solutions. At the same time, system change, because it's a system that is problem, that's deeply entrenched with so many issues that's causing inequality. But at the same time, we have to talk about solidarity and collective action, without which nothing is going to happen. And three words that we as civil society coined together in the last few years, and which I use that as my reference point, I would say truth, transformation, and hope. So truth is important. We have to speak truth to power. What's happening, we have to say what's happening. Let's not shy away, or let's not hold ourselves back. At the same time, talk about transformation, because this incremental change is not going to take us anywhere where we are. And third is hope. While we talk about truth and massive transformation that is needed, we can't leave people hopeless. We have to talk about hope.
Thank you, Harjeet. Would anyone else like to speak in? Nikki from there, or Ian, or Johanna, or Sanlan? Nikki would like, and then Ian, would you like to feed?
I was going to happily give Dr. Fry the floor first, since I went first last time. If there's still time, I'll come in.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. Specifically on the questions about, holding company directors, responsible. Clearly, we have to look at it, this issue. And I don't want to get into a discussion about whether it's defined as ecocide or not, because it's from a human rights perspective, it's the rights of life, it's the rights to food, it's the right to health. All these clear human rights that we've established are being affected by the actions and decisions made by directors, and so we have to hold them accountable. With respect to sort of the Energy Charter treaties, that was primarily what I was talking about, is these investment treaties and arbitration that is giving protection to the energy industries again, and particularly finding decisions in favour of the fossil fuel industries, and we have to reform that. And that's a critical area. And the Energy Charter Treaty is one of those where we have to have clear reforms to that treaty. So I certainly support that. Just quickly, sort of to give you an overview of where I'm thinking in my mandate, just to give people an idea of that. I have to report to the UN General Assembly and to the Human Rights Council, these reports every 6 months. So I've tried to divide my work up into thematic areas, but critically, these are, linked. But I can't do it all at once, and this is the challenge for me in this sort of climate emergency we're dealing with. So I certainly want to look at the issue of loss and damage and to put a human rights lens on that. And that work has been developed clearly a lot by what the IPCC have said in their most recent report. The issue of climate change displacement is a critical issue that we're suffering now, and we. People who displace across international borders aren't given the level of protection. They're not defined as refugees, so they fall through the cracks. Clearly, in this discussion, we've looked at the issue of litigation, and particularly, I want to look at this issue of intergenerational equity and intergenerational justice, because this is a fundamental issue that we have a responsibility to future generations. Within this discussion, I've talked about corporate accountability, and I'll be looking at the whole issue of just transition. As Harjeet has said, it's a critical part of this whole picture that we have to place. And also looking at the implications of new technologies and maybe some of the old technologies as well, like hydro dams and things like that. We know that Indigenous peoples are affected by those dams already. So these technologies that we're finding as solutions to the impacts of climate change, also some of those have impacts as well, and we have to be mindful of those. Thank you.
Thank you. Nikki.
Sure. There were so many great questions that were raised and comments made, and I won't be able to do justice to all of them by any means. I did just want to really hold up the critical point that I think a number of the questions and panelists have also made, and certainly Harjeet was very eloquent on this, underscoring that the impediments really ultimately are political and not technical or scientific. They're political and the vested interest in the fossil economy, and that there is funding that is there and available if we shift fossil fuel subsidies, but we cannot be making demands of those most vulnerable and those least responsible to shift without following that up. And I do think the question, from the audience, from someone in Grenada, also was, underscoring the need to shift the politics of the fossil economy. But I wanted to just quickly touch on the ECT. Certainly, the Energy Charter Treaty is the kind of exhibit A of how investor-state dispute settlement can be used improperly in the hands of fossil fuel companies, potentially to thwart and slow the transition. And there are a lot of ongoing efforts, both through political the pressure campaigns and reform processes to push for withdrawal and to justify withdrawal from this treaty, because it is fundamentally incompatible with the need to rapidly evolve energy and environmental policy in the midst of a crisis. It is at odds, and it is designed to kind of stabilize or lock in place a policy regime for investors, incumbent investors, and that's not compatible. And I know that there are underway legal challenges, in fact, actually seeking to compel countries in the European Union to withdraw from the Energy Charter Treaty because it's incompatible with their human rights obligations to pursue action to phase out fossil fuels to protect and prevent foreseeable harm. So that's definitely a space to watch. And on directors' liability and accountability, I think ecocide is an interesting whole conversation unto itself, but I certainly think there are other grounds on which to hold directors accountable, their own obligations to their own fiduciaries, their investors, and their own companies for the considerable financial risk that they're facing, and the irresponsibility of both misrepresenting the impacts of their products and not addressing the massive transition and physical risk that climate change poses. I also just to touch on the question or comment from the youth, I will still say youth representative from the Philippines, who is civil society in the room, that I think we do need to keep our eyes peeled for the dangers of replicating systems of extraction and exploitation as we shift to intensifying renewable resources, and that we absolutely need to strengthen the need to respect human rights and to center disclosure, transparent, and sustainable approaches to identifying new resources for those renewable energy, and actually reducing demand, so we don't just replace overconsumption by overconsumption. And I do think, I don't know if, well, it's hard to look into a crystal ball about the future where we're heading. I do think there are changes underway already with growing recognition of the right to a healthy environment, growing recognition of what human rights law requires in the midst of this mounting, accelerating crisis. But we are going to see, before I think we will actually see legislation or law compelling phase out, we might see that finance and the economics of the need to phase out take precedence. And very last, just to come back to the original question asked in the first round about the need for participatory evidence creation and expanding participation and generating the evidence for cases. I think that the IPCC's acknowledgement in these latest reports of the importance of traditional Indigenous peoples' knowledge and community knowledge is critical to this. And the Philippines Commission process really exemplifies what can be done when you elevate and recognize the knowledge that people on the front lines have of their own lived experience, and you give that due weight in these processes of accountability. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And we are really at the end of our, I'm very sorry for the other questions. We are at the end. I just want to ask these amazing audience and amazing panelists here, one sentence of a wisdom or an encouragement or an empowerment to share with the audience. Would anyone like to share? Johanna.
Yeah, I think speaking as a person and not as IPCC, but I think changing public narrative, what is possible. I think there's a lot of fear, when there is change. So being, I don't know, maybe it's naive, but like positive framing that, that the world that we want is possible if we do these choices.
I would say we need to start looking at all these fights as connected fights and fight for system change and not just climate change.
Well, the climate crisis says we have to accelerate our action, and that's the critical thing ahead of us. So we've just got to get out of our sort of mindsets and accelerate our thinking. Thank you.
Climate change is definitely our biggest threat, and I think we need to move into uncharted waters with confidence and pursue our collective effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Nikki?
Just strongly agree that the common roots of these converging crises in the fossil economy need to compel and accelerate systems change, and that we need to center human rights and communities that are the holders of solutions to these crises and a new way forward. Thanks.
Thank you all. And when you're looking at a situation that you think, are we mad? Why is this happening? Why are we using the root causes and driving them forward when we know what's there? Think about the money, think about the power, think about who's making the decisions and why those decisions may be made. There's a big difference between centralized and decentralized. And some of this is also a power shift. So ask the questions, think of the elephants in the room, and don't be afraid to engage on them. And don't be afraid to talk about ethics or morals or protecting our future generations, because that's what we want to do. Thank you.
Thank you all for organizing.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Enjoy the rest of your days.